The critique that I'm going to make tonight of Western medicine and in providing an alternative, it's not new, actually. People have been saying this for a long, long time. In 2017, a fellow Canadian physician, Dr. Norman Doidge, also an author, writes about brain and neuroplasticity, said that modern scientific medicine has taken a fundamentally materialist approach, and it is analytical, meaning that it divides wholes into parts. It often proceeds by reducing complex phenomena to their more elementary chemical and physical components, viruses, genes, molecules. And what I'm trying to say to you here is that the critique that I'm going to make tonight of Western medicine and in providing an alternative, it's not new, actually. People have been saying this for a long, long time. And let me just give you 3 medical facts here, and you'll see immediately how inadequate and insufficient the Western medical perspective is in explaining these facts that I'm about to give you. The first fact is a study that was done in the United States last year, or I should say 2 years ago now, that showed that the more episodes of racism an American black woman experiences, the greater her risk for asthma. Now, you can't explain that on molecular grounds. Let me give another fact. In the 1930s and 40s, the gender ratio of multiple sclerosis, which is a inflammatory degenerative disease of the nervous system, was 1:1. In other words, for every man, there was a woman diagnosed. You know what the ratio now is? It's 3.5 women to every man. Now that immediately tells us, A, it can't be genetic, because the genes don't change in a population over 7 decades or even 10 decades or longer. Number 2, it can't be diet, because that doesn't change for a population. It didn't change more for women than for men, nor can it be the climate. There's something going on. And whatever it is, it can't just be biological. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at how you treat asthma, is you give, to open up the airways and to suppress the inflammation that happens in the asthmatic airway, you give inhalers or medications by mouth, which are copies of adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline and cortisol are the stress hormones of the body. I'll talk about them later. They're secreted by the adrenal gland in response to a threat. So there's adrenaline and cortisol. So we're treating asthma with stress hormones. How do we treat multiple sclerosis? If you have a flare-up of your multiple sclerosis, you're going to get an infusion of the stress hormone cortisol. If you've ever been to a dermatologist with a skin flare-up, some kind of chronic psoriasis or eczema, most of the time you're going to get a steroid cream, a copy of cortisol. If you go to a rheumatologist with inflamed joints or connective tissues, guess what they're going to give you? Steroids, cortisol, in all autoimmune diseases. I could go on. So here's the interesting question. We're treating all these conditions across medicine with stress hormones, but we're not asking ourselves a simple question. Is it possible that stress may have something to do with the onset of this condition? Has something happened to the body's stress apparatus that we have to give people now larger quantities of stress hormone to keep them from having symptoms? And of course, as in the case of the racism-induced asthmatic attack, we can see that obviously emotional factors must be playing a role here. And not just emotional factors, because the black woman who experiences racism isn't an isolated particle responding to nothing in the environment. She's affected by a social circumstance, a social, economic, political circumstance. And so George Engel, in 1977, called for what he termed a biopsychosocial approach for medicine. And he said, the boundaries between health and disease, between well and sick, are far from clear and will never be clear because they're affected by cultural, social, and psychological considerations. That was 1977. And that wasn't new either. Back in Roman times, the Greek physician Galen already pointed out that women who are depressed are more likely to have breast cancer. And now we have the actual studies to show why, and I'll refer to them later. So what I'm saying is that this awareness, this intuitive awareness that you can't separate the mind from the body, and you can't separate the individual from the environment, is not new in medicine. What is new is that now we have the science to actually prove it. And what is remarkable and lamentable at the same time is that despite the scientific evidence, medical practice still doesn't take into account. In my experience, I began to notice that there were certain patterns as to who got ill and who didn't get ill. And these patterns just kept reasserting themselves over and over and over again until they became inescapable in my awareness. And what these patterns were, I'll illustrate for you by means of some newspaper clippings from the Canadian newspaper, the Globe and Mail, for which I wrote a medical column for a number of years. And these stories from the paper illustrate aspects of what I call the disease-prone personality. The first is a first-person story written by a woman called Donna, who's diagnosed with breast cancer, and she goes to her doctor, and she's describing the experience of the diagnosis. What you need to know is that her doctor's name is Harold, and her husband's name is Hai. Now, Hai's first wife died of breast cancer, and now Donna, the second wife, is diagnosed with the same condition. And Donna writes, Harold tells me that the lump is small, and most assuredly not in my lymph nodes, unlike that of Hai's first wife, whose cancer had spread everywhere by the time they found it. You're not going to die, he reassures me. But I'm worried about Hai, I say. I won't have the strength to support him. Now, what's wrong with this picture? First thought that she has is, how will I look after my husband's emotional needs? So this automatic and compulsive concern for the emotional needs of others while ignoring your own is a major risk factor for disease for reasons that I'm going to tell you. The other segments I'll cite for you now are obituaries. And obituaries are fascinating because they tell us not just about the person who died, but also about what we as a society value in one another. And what we value in one another is often what kills people. You've heard the expression, the good die young? They often do. And there's a reason for it. This is a physician who died at age 55 in Toronto. Never for a day did he contemplate giving up the work he so loved at Toronto's Sick Children's Hospital. He carried on with his duties throughout his year-long battle with cancer, stopping only a few days before he died. Now, again, if a friend of yours is diagnosed with a malignancy, is that what you would say to them? Go back to work and keep working until you drop? So there's this rigid and compulsive identification with duty, role, and responsibility rather than the needs of the self is another risk factor for illness. The third obituary, the second obituary I'll read you is about a woman called Naomi. This is written by her grateful husband. And she died of breast cancer at age 55. And the husband writes, in her entire life, she never got into a fight with anyone. The worst she could say was phooey or something else along those lines. She had no ego. She just blended in with the environment in an unassuming manner. Now, my wife Ray, I think, is in the audience, and we were married 50 years this year. And believe me, there have been many times when I wished that she would blend in with the environment in an unassuming manner, as I'm sure many of you have who have partners or spouses of any type. But if your partner wants to stay healthy, they will not blend in with the environment. And really what's being described here is the repression of healthy anger. And the repression of healthy anger, we know, suppresses the immune system. And it's literally the commonest characteristic that I've seen in people with malignancy and autoimmune disease. When I say repression, I mean that they don't even allow themselves to experience the anger. And the final obituary I read, this is a man called Sidney. He was the physician, died age 72 of cancer. Sidney and his mother had an incredibly special relationship, a bond that was apparent in all aspects of their lives until her death. As a married man with young children, Sidney made a point to have dinner with his parents every day as his wife Rosalind and their 4 kids waited for him at home. He would walk in, greeted by yet another dinner to eat and to enjoy. Never wanting to disappoint either woman in his life, Sidney kept having 2 dinners a day for years until gradual weight gain began to raise suspicions. And this is presented as a wonderful example of loyalty to the parent. And what is actually being described here is a poor man who suffered from 2 fatal beliefs. And when I say fatal, I mean literally fatal. One is that he's responsible for how the people feel, and 2, that he must never disappoint anybody. I think that what we need is a broader view of medicine. And so the perspective that I'm going to present to you here is along the lines of what George Engel called the biopsychosocial perspective, which simply says that the biology of human beings can't be separated from their social and emotional processes, dynamics, and environments. The great trauma psychiatrist, my friend of mine, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, and Bessel says in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, our culture teaches us to focus on personal uniqueness, but on a deeper level, we barely exist as individual organisms. Our brains are built to help us function as members of a tribe. And that's not new either, because if you go back 2,500 years to the Buddha, the Buddha talked about what he called the interdependent co-arising of phenomena. And he said that every phenomena arises in relationship to every other phenomena. You can't separate anything from anything else. And he said, contemplate the nature of interconnected co-arising during every moment. When you look at a leaf or a raindrop, meditate on all the conditions, near and distant, that have contributed to the presence of that leaf or raindrop. The birth and death of any phenomenon, he says, are connected to the birth and death of all other phenomena. The one contains the many, and the many contains the one. Without the one, there cannot be the many. Without the many, there cannot be the one. And so the perspective I will propose here for you is that biopsychosocial perspective. And from that perspective, illness is not an entity in itself. It is actually the manifestation of a person's life in a certain context, to which many factors contribute, but the psychological cannot be separated from the physical, and the physical and the psychological aspects of the individual cannot be separated from his or her social connections and existence, and therefore from the culture that they live in. And if we're going to be fully inclusive about human beings, I'll have to bring in another dimension, which of course is heresy in medical terms, which is the spiritual one. And so basically, we're biopsychosocial spiritual creatures. And spiritual simply means that there's more to us than the little ego that many of us are hung up on, and which rules this particular society. The second point I'm going to make for you is that disease is not a fixed entity. It's a process. And that process is not separated from that person's lives. So that how the multiple sclerosis will behave is not simply a characteristic of the disease. It reflects what's happening in the life of that particular individual. Which is, by the way, why we're seeing 3 times as much in women right now, which I'll talk about later. But it's a process. And if it's a process that somehow manifests how we're living our lives, then we can actually perhaps do something about it. And I'm not here trying to give you an alternative to Western medicine, which has many wonderful achievements to its credit and can perform miracles really, as we all know. But there's something missing. And what's missing is that we don't know from the Western medical perspective how to promote the healing process within the patient, himself or herself, or themselves. And from that perspective, illness is not just meant to be battled. It's meant to be come to terms with, understood, inquired into as to what its message is. And from that perspective, illness is a potential teacher. And that invites and actually necessitates an inquiry. Now let me give you another British medical fact. Stephen Hawking, the physicist who died, 2 years ago, in his mid-70s, of ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or known in Britain as motor neuron disease. Do you know he was diagnosed at age 20? You know how long he was given to live? 2 years. He should have died well over 50 years ago. Something didn't figure in the equation, did it? Otherwise he would have succumbed much longer. And many people do succumb, of course. So the disease does not have a life of its own. It does manifest the life and functioning and social circumstances of the individual. There was the great British cellist Jacqueline du Pré, who died of multiple sclerosis in her 40s. She put so much emotion into her playing. So they call that her cello voice. But she was never able to express her emotions in real life. In fact, she tried to fit in just to be the person everybody wanted her to be. Her sister said that she was always the Jackie that circumstances demanded. Well, that's totally typical of everybody with multiple sclerosis. Why? And you might think at this point, well, she didn't actually want it any more than King Albert wanted to become King George. No more than that did Jackie want to become a cello virtuoso. She envied somebody who gave up the cello, but she said, I can't do it because people would be so disappointed in me. She said she actually was afraid that it would kill her, and it did. When she was 7 or 8 years old, I forget exactly, I read Hillary's account of this. She said that to her sister, Hill, don't tell our mommy this, but when I will grow up, I won't be able to move or walk. That's exactly what happened by the time she was in her 30s. And it's very interesting here because sometimes people have this intuitive feeling. Jonathan Swift, the great satirist and writer, author of Gulliver's Travels, who died with severe Alzheimer's dementia, said to a doctor friend of his as they were walking outside one day, looking at this tree losing its leaves, and Swift said, I shall be like that tree. I shall die first at the top. There's something in us that knows. Jacqueline du Pré went to Russia to study the cello, the land of music. She was raped there. She comes back to England and says to Hillary, Hillary, don't tell our mommy this, but I was raped in Russia. Now notice both times, don't tell our mommy this. She doesn't want to hurt the mummy's feelings or upset the mummy. I'm not blaming anybody for the disease because these patterns that I'm describing are not conscious on anybody's part. Nobody chooses them deliberately. But there's a sense, but there's responsibility here. By responsibility, I don't mean in any sense guilt or blame. I mean in the sense that if you actually look at who gets sick and why, yes, there's certain patterns and dynamics, certain beliefs that they hold about themselves and their relationship to the world that actually, I'm not going to say causes the illness, but contributes significantly to the onset of the illness. And furthermore, there's another meaning to the word responsibility, responsible, which is response-able. We want people to be response-able. And I can tell you, I know people with multiple sclerosis who once they become response-able, once they look at the flare-ups and what stresses led to the flare-ups and how they unwittingly contributed to those stresses and learn how to prevent the next flare-up, their disease actually is significantly mitigated. And that's what I mean by responsibility. I mean response-ability. The question is, why do people do that? Why do they suppress themselves? Why do they try to please others? The key point here is that there are two basic needs that human beings have. One is for attachment. Now, attachment is absolutely essential for human survival. Attachment is actually a biological drive. It's an instinct to be close to another person. Why do we have that drive? Because without it, we can't survive. The human infant is the most helpless, most dependent, least capable creature in the universe. And so without an attachment drive that calls that infant to come close to the mother, to be taken care of, or to the father, to the parenting figures, and without an equivalent attachment drive on the part of the parenting figure to be close to the baby, there's no survival of the infant. Reptiles can get away with it, birds can't, mammals can't, and least of all can human beings. So the attachment drive is like a gravitational force that pulls two bodies together for the purpose of being taken care of, or to take care of the other. So that attachment drive is not negotiable. We can't survive without it, nor could we have survived as individuals as we evolved from our pre-hominid ancestors, and over millions of years, or hundreds of thousands of years, people had to attach to each other in small groups in order to survive. So that's just a basic need. But we have another need that's also important in the long term, and that need is for authenticity. And authenticity means knowing what you feel in your guts and being able to act on it. And when you think of human evolution, or think of any animal out there in the wild today, just how long does an organism, a creature, survive out there in the wild if they're not in touch with their gut feelings? So we have these two important needs: attachment and authenticity. Auto, the self, being in touch with ourselves. Now, that's fine. But what if you're 2 years old and your mother doesn't give you another cookie before dinner, so you do what a 2-year-old does when they don't get another cookie? You throw a tantrum. And then you get the message, good little kids don't get angry. You might even be punished. Jordan Peterson, the Canadian so-called psychologist, says that an angry child should be made to sit by themselves. So the message that the angry child gets is not that good little kids don't get angry, but that angry little kids don't get loved. No, what I told you was that the attachment drive is not negotiable. If I get the message that my healthy anger, which is just expressing how I'm feeling, is unacceptable and threatens my attachment relationship because I'm going to lose the parent if I do it, what do you suppose I'll do? What do you think is going to get sacrificed? The attachment? Impossible. In every case, the authenticity is going to be sacrificed, and now we become separated from ourselves. Because of the way this society raises children, and stresses parents. The result is a lot of people who are completely disconnected from themselves and who are not in touch with their feelings. The point is that the personality that we develop is not actually a reflection of our true selves. Very often it's their defenses against the loss of love. And so it's not us. An illness comes along when we're not being ourselves. When you don't get the attention that you needed as a child, as an infant, you'll be consumed by attracting attention. And now you're going to be very attractive. Now, how many times have you passed a mirror without wondering if you're attractive enough? You're just looking for love. If you didn't get the approval that you needed as a child just for existing, just for being who you were, you will want to be winning approval all the time. You'll be a winning personality. If you weren't valued, you want to measure up. If you weren't made to feel special just because for who you were, you might be demanding. If you weren't esteemed for who you were, then you might want to impress people. If you weren't made to feel important for just who you were, then you go to medical school like I did, and you want to make yourself important. If you weren't liked for who you were, you're going to be very nice, so that people will like you, so that you can have this simulacrum of love. If you weren't loved, you'll be very charming. But all of this demands that you actually suppress your own feelings. Now, how does that lead to illness? It leads to illness because it's very stressful always to be playing a role. It's actually stressful. And there's always the fear behind it. It's fear-driven. And fear is a state of being in stress. Now, the stress hormones, if I were to scream at you right now and frighten you, you would have a stress response. By the way, just to indicate how inseparable the mind is from the body, that's how simple it is. I could change your physiology in this room. I could change the physiology of 1,500 people in this room without touching them, simply by generating a credible threat. If I had a weapon, for example, and screamed at you, your physiology would change in a split second. That doesn't just happen in extreme circumstances. It happens every moment of our lives, that our physiology responds to our emotions. Now, if I were to stress you right now, to induce fear in you like that, your adrenaline levels will go up and your cortisol levels will go up. Because what happened is that the fear center in the brain would communicate with the hypothalamus in the brain, which is the apex of the autonomic nervous system and also of our hormonal apparatus, and then messages through your autonomic nervous system would go through to the entire body, and then hormones would be released, and then your adrenal gland would respond by secreting adrenaline, which gives you more energy, more strength, more speed for the flight or fight response that you have to generate. And you'd have cortisol released as well, which gives you more sugar so that you can be more energetic again in the escape or struggle response to stress. So in the short term, these hormones save your life. In the long term, they kill you. Adrenaline secreted over a long period of time elevates your blood pressure, narrows your blood vessels, makes you more prone for heart disease or strokes. Cortisol in the long term depresses, makes you depressed actually. It thins your bones, so you're going to get osteoporosis. It can ulcerate your intestines. You can put fat on your belly in a way that promotes heart disease, and also it suppresses your immune system. So people chronically stressed, we know, have diminished activity of their immune system. So for example, people who are bereaved and after a strong, close relationship, of course, depending on the level of social support they have, but the more alone they are, the more likely they're going to have a high level of a stress response, and you can measure activity of the immune system as being diminished. And people who are lonely get sick faster and they die quicker of their diseases. After a bad divorce, it's even worse. The suppression and disturbance of the immune system, according to studies. And this diminished activity of a group of cells called natural killer cells. Natural killer cells attack malignant cells and attack foreign invaders. Bereavement depresses the immune system. In Australia, there was a study. They looked at 500 women with breast lumps that needed to be biopsied to make sure that it wasn't malignant. And before the results were in, the women underwent a psychological questionnaire. And what they found was that if a woman was emotionally isolated, that by itself didn't increase the chance of that lump being cancerous. If a woman was highly stressed around the onset of that lump, that by itself also didn't increase the chance of that lump being cancerous. But if a woman was emotionally isolated and stressed, the chance of the lump being cancerous was 9 times as great as the average. And the researchers, being medical scientists who think from up here, they couldn't figure this one out, because they said, how does 0 plus 0 add up to 9? If there's 0 effect here, 0 effect there, what's happening? Well, of course it's obvious. What's happening is, for example, in the front row, person at the very aisle seat here, if you're very stressed and you have these high levels of stress hormones which are affecting your immune system, and if you're all alone with it for months, you might be in trouble. But if there's a friend of yours sitting next to you and says, hey friend, hey sweetheart, hey buddy, you seem upset, do you want to talk about it? What happens to your stress hormones? Your nervous system relaxes, your heart rate decreases, your intestinal muscles in the gut relax, and your stress hormone levels go way down. We're biopsychosocial creatures. And so these patterns of emotional self-suppression, they promote illness in part because they leave us completely alone. Because whether we're alone or not does not depend on how many friends we have. And again, I'm quoting Bessel van der Kolk. He says, social support is not the same as being merely in the presence of others. The critical issue is reciprocity, being truly heard and seen by the people around us, feeling that we're held in someone else's heart and mind. But if I'm suppressing who I am, nobody's ever going to see me. And I might be very nice, and there might be 1,000 people who love me, but none of them know me. And I'm totally isolated, really at heart. And that's what's going on. Stress is, by the way, there's another mechanism by which stress and early childhood negative experiences lead to disease, which is simply through inflammation. So we know, for example, that the more trauma a child experiences, the greater the level of inflammatory particles in their bloodstream as adults. You can measure inflammatory proteins in the bloodstream, and the more stress you had as a kid, the higher they're going to be. And the more stress you have, there's another structure. I mean, the information is just coming in all the time. It's hard to even keep up with it. There's a structure called telomeres. Telomeres are structures at the end of your chromosomes, like the shoelace has a glue at the end to keep the strands together. Telomeres keep the chromosome together. Telomeres shorten with stress. They also shorten with age. So children who are traumatized, for example, have shorter telomeres, which means that they're chronologically older than their peers. And so there's many mechanisms by which stress affects the body that way. But let me talk to you about stress for a moment. So stress has 3 components, and this is maybe the takeaway. There's the external event called the stressor. So the first component of the stress reaction is the event, okay? The third and final component of the stress reaction is the physiological stress response, with the adrenaline, the cortisol, and the nervous system, and the gut, and the heart, and really the whole body. But in between the external event and the physiological reaction is what we can call the processing apparatus. And the processing apparatus is you and I, with our particular interpretations, our beliefs, usually unconscious interpretations, unconscious beliefs, internal and emotional dynamics that we have no control over. That's until we become conscious of them. So really the whole point of this talk is to become conscious of what's happening inside us. John Bowlby, the great British psychiatrist and researcher of attachment, talked about the infant's or the young child's response when the mother doesn't show up. The first response of the infant or the child, actually the young child, is anxiety when the mother doesn't come back. The second response is depression. Kind of gives up. Life is not worth living without the mom. And then the kid starts acting normally. He'll eat again, he'll interact and play again. And when the mother does come back, this has happened when kids were hospitalized and the mothers were told not to visit because it's too upsetting for the kid to see the mother come and go, which is wrong, but this is how they did it. The child is physiologically stressed. Her heart rate goes up, but she won't even look at the mother. And Bowlby calls this defensive detachment. It's a self-protection. The message is, I was so hurt when you abandoned me that I will not make myself vulnerable again to that same degree of pain. And these reactions get programmed into our brains, so much so that 5 decades later, I go into the physiological mental response of the infant until I become conscious that this is what's happening. When I become conscious, I can say to myself, well, oh, okay. I'm just telling a story to myself. The story of rejection and abandonment is just a story. And even if I was being rejected and abandoned, I'm not a helpless infant anymore. But you see, we all tell ourselves these stories. And these stories often run our lives. And to the extent that they're unconscious, and to the extent that we keep suppressing ourselves for the sake of attachment, for the sake of being accepted and loved and respected and accepted by others, and we're disconnected from our true selves, to that extent we're stressing ourselves, and to that degree we're actually making ourselves sick. And from that point of view, illness comes along to teach you something. And when illness does come along, and then there's many, many people now who, when they did get sick, rather than just simply see it as a calamity to battle against, they also saw it as an opportunity to learn. And what people keep learning over and over again is how they had not been themselves. Illness came along to bring them back to themselves. The point is that nobody should be a passive recipient of anybody else's care. We need to regain that sense of agency. Is that sense of agency of actually making the decisions and actually looking at our lives and our patterns and our dynamics and really being courageous about that and being open about it and being supremely curious and not judging ourselves. Oh God, I failed, I was too nice, I pushed myself down. No. But ask yourself, okay, why was I doing that? And do I really need to do that? Am I still really that infant, a young child, who needs to choose attachment over authenticity? And yes, I may lose some friends who are used to me being this particular way, and that's what they signed up for. But my true friends will celebrate me for finally being myself. The Canadian stress researcher Hans Selye, himself from Hungary like myself, and he coined the word stress, the way we use it today. He said that in the modern world, stresses are mostly emotional, he said, and the biggest stress of all is trying to be something other than who you are. So if there's a takeaway lesson here, it's get to know who you are and be who you are.